Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I very much hope you enjoy your time with us today. I am Professor Sarah Brough. I'm the former Associate Dean of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion in the Faculty of Science at the University of New South Wales. And I'm delighted to be hosting today's lecture on increasing the representation of women in senior roles. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Camaragal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land from which I am joining. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are here with us this afternoon. I also encourage all of you to acknowledge the land from which you're joining us in the live event Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen. I'd like to acknowledge the role of the traditional owners and the Indigenous people of Australia as the first knowledge creators, and their very deep understanding of the land, the sea and the sky, which forms a very important source of understanding of Australia, which should feed into all of our scientific understandings. Today's Inclusive Science webinar will be recorded, so if you need to leave the presentation early or miss any part, you can watch this again at your convenience, as the link to the recording will be emailed out to everyone who's registered. For today's lecture, we'll be hearing 3 presentations from our panelists, followed by a Q&A session where we encourage active audience participation and welcome any questions you may have, which you can enter in the live event Q&A panel from now and throughout the presentations. I'm very pleased to be hosting today's lecture, as we'll be addressing the importance of inclusive science, acknowledging gaps in our practices, and working with our communities to create inclusive spaces and leadership. To kick off our session today, I will hand over to Professor Lisa Cooley.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Today I'm going to be talking about closing the gender gap in Australia's STEM, and I'm going to be showing you how we've been closing the gender gap in astrophysics, a male-dominated area. Next slide, please. So this is the gender gap currently in Australia's STEM, and when I'm using the term STEM, I'm including science, technology, engineering, mathematics and medicine. And this data is based on the Australian Academy of Science SAGE program data. And SAGE is a version of the Athena SWAN program that was developed in the UK and requires universities to submit a range of different data, and then the SAGE program provides universities with awards, gold or silver or bronze, according to how well the organisations are going towards, in one way, closing the gender gap, so increasing the representation of women at all levels within universities. It's now been broadened to include other forms of diversity. Now, this is the current gender gap based on Australian SAGE data, and this includes 22 universities across Australia. And the purple will show you the fraction of women at each grade in Australia. So we've got postdoc starting at grade 6 in the UK, and this is grade A or level A in Australia, going right up to professor, which is level E in Australia, or grade 10 in the UK. I'm also using over 100 UK universities Athena SWAN data to show you the UK as a comparison point. So the UK is shown in orange, and it's the Australian women are shown in purple dashes, and the Australian men are shown in orange dashes. And the UK women are the solid lines, and the UK men are solid lines. And you can see that at the lower levels across STEM, Australia has a slightly larger fraction of women at level A and level B, but then we have almost identical fractions of women between the UK and Australia at all the senior levels. And so this suggests that in Australia and the UK, we've had very similar promotion, recruitment and departure rates over, the last decade or two. Next slide, please. Now we're going to have a look at the Australian detailed data for STEM. So I've shown you here 3 different histograms. The one on the left is recruitment rates. The middle figure shows you the promotion rates, and the right figure shows you departure rates. And these are shown for Australian women and men and the UK women and men. And there's a few things that are immediately obvious here. The recruitment rates for women and men are very different, particularly at those higher levels. But the promotion rates for Australian women and men are fairly similar within the eras. The departure rates are also similar for men and women within the eras in Australia, except that more men are leaving at the professor level, and I think this is due to primarily more men retiring from that level at the moment, but also being promoted into senior management positions, either within or outside the university sector. Now, if we move on to the next slide, now I take these promotion and recruitment and departure rates, and we have a look in a little bit more detail at those recruitment ratios. And now what I'm doing is I'm showing you the ratio of men to women being hired, and this is just a 1-to-1 ratio at each of the different levels. And so in Australia, which is the green line, you can see that at the postdoc and the lecturer level in STEM, women are being employed at about the same rate as men. But at the senior levels, senior lecturer, reader and professor levels, men are being hired more than women. And in fact, it's about 1.5 to twice the rate of women. And in the UK, this is happening actually across the board. And so this is actually contributing, the major contributor to the gender gap. So next slide, please. So I'm going to now show you my data-driven workforce models. What I've done is I've created an Australian average university based on the Academy of Science SAGE data. I take the initial population of males and females at each level from the SAGE data, and then using those higher rates I just showed you, I hire people into each of the levels. Based on the departure rates from the SAGE data, people depart each level, and then people are promoted to the next level at each year using the SAGE data promotion rates. And then I calculate the population of men and women in each level annually, and so I can then predict the gender gap and how that gender gap will change with time. This has been tested on HERDIT, the Higher Education Research Database data, and I'm able to reproduce the 2019 data starting with 1999 data. So the models are consistent across 20-year period. Now I'm going to show you forward modelling. Next slide, please. We're going to start with the status quo models. So this is the current gender gap that you saw before for men and women. Women here are in blue and the men are in black, and these are just the percentages at each level in Australia. If we stick with the current population weighted average recruitment rates, departure rates and promotion rates, here's what's going to happen in Australia as we move forwards in time. If you can click on, please. So you can see that we're moving forwards in time rapidly. Now 2040, 2045, 2040, 2050, 2065. Now we're at 2070. The models have actually reached a steady state or a sort of a plateau. They're not changing very much at all. And this is where we will be if we continue with the current average recruitment, departure and promotion rates in Australian STEM. So what this means is that the gender gap actually can't be closed with those status quo rates. We actually need to change what we're doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so we saw before that we have unequal hiring at those higher levels, and that includes levels C, D and E. What if we were to do 50-50 hiring at all levels? So the Australian Commonwealth Equal Opportunity for Women in the Workplace Act states that all employers with 100 or more employees and all higher education institutions must implement an affirmative action program to promote equal opportunity for women, and this is designed to correct for a historical underrepresentation. Lots of universities are doing various forms of this at the moment. That includes female-only hires in some places and some departments, as well as 50-50 hiring also in some universities and some departments. And so the workplace gender Equality Act in 2012 requires universities to lodge reports each year on how they're doing regarding gender equality indicators. Next slide, please. So one thing that organisations can do is check using these types of models, workplace forward modelling, to check how their recruitment and departure and promotion rates are going to achieve 50-50 moving forwards in time. So here's an example of what we can do in an organisation, an average organisation in Australia, if we introduce 50-50 hiring. If you can click on, please. Thank you. So with 50-50 hiring, the gap actually begins to close a lot faster. And by 2030, around 2035 to 2040, we've actually basically closed the gap. This is within 5%, which is about the error range of the models. And so this is actually the only thing that we need to do in Australia for an average Australian organisation, providing that we don't have a retention issue and that promotions are being done equally relative to cohorts. The only thing we need to do is 50-50 hiring. Next slide, please. Now, this can be difficult in some areas. I'm going to show you just quickly an example of this in astronomy. So astronomy is a very male-dominated field, and when I ran my gender models for astronomy, what it showed was that we're never going to achieve 50-50, even with 50-50 hires. And that's because retention is a real issue in astronomy, and that women are leaving specific levels at about twice the rate as men. And my models show that if we did 50-50 hiring and retention, then we're able to reach 30% women at all levels by 2039, and then 50% at most levels by around 2055. But that we also need some of 50 in any sort of reasonable time frame, and by reasonable, that's around 2050. However, it actually can be done even in a beginning with a male-dominated field like astronomy. Next slide, please. So we've done this in Astro 3D, which is our Centre of Excellence, and this is a centre that covers 270 people. We began with between 20 to 35% women at every level, and that depended on the levels. And our goal was to achieve 50-50 in 4 years, so 50-50 by the end of this year, 2021. Now, this is our Executive Management Committee. We started with top down, so 50-50 at the highest levels first. Next slide, please. Then what we did was we introduced a range of initiatives. Previously, we had a range of initiatives that are fairly standard, and then we started introducing new initiatives focusing on culture in particular, building a positive culture and on retention. And what happened after we started introducing those new initiatives were that once we made postdoc hires and also faculty hires, we started increasing our fraction of women. And by December 2020, we'd achieved around 43% women. What was surprising after that was that once we'd achieved over 40% women at the highest levels, we had low numbers of female students. We only had about 30% students. That ramped up. It doubled in a year. And so we actually have achieved this last bit from 43% up to 48% women we have at the moment because our student numbers increased. And so this has been rather dramatic, and the students choose us, not the other way around. And so this has really meant that we're actually now attracting female students into the field, which we weren't previously doing. Next slide, please. Now, what I think is really key about this is having women leaders, because if you don't have women leaders, then you're not attracting the applicants from female candidates and from female students in your teams. And so this figure shows you all the different teams that we have in our centre. Each of them contain between 10 to 30 or even up to 40 people in each of these teams. And on the left are the female-led teams, and on the right are the male-led teams. And this is what's happened over the 4 years. to the proportion of women. You can see that in the female teams, we've got now over 50%, 50 or over 50% women in most of those teams, with the exception of Team 5, which is an engineering team. And with our male leads, we have almost the exact opposite effect, where we're actually attracting more males to the teams. Next slide, please. And so I just want to give a quick summary into what we've found is that you can achieve 50-50 with a range of hiring initiatives and focusing on building a positive climate. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but it is what we did is published in my Nature Astronomy publications. And the models are really powerful. It's not just what I showed you in my talk. They can be used to test the potential impact of new initiatives, not just in hiring, but in promotions or in retention. They can provide advice on which initiatives will produce the fastest impact on diversity. I have done models of COVID-19 productivity impacts and impacts on staffing freezes or cuts. And they can also be used to estimate historical implicit bias. And then they can drill down into individual universities or colleges, schools or departments. And this is something that I'm doing at the moment as a consultant to a range of different universities, including University of Queensland and the ANU. They can also be applied to other minorities. It's not specific to genders per se. And I think I'll end there, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. That was amazing. It's just wonderful to see the evidence around how you build those models and how you can test different initiatives. So my name's Fiona Stapleton. I'm currently the academic lead for Athena SWAN at UNSW. I'm a Scientia Professor and formerly the Associate Dean Enterprise in Science and Head of School of Optometry and Vision Science. I can have my next slide, please, Michaela. Thank you. So, as Lisa has described, talking about the Athena SWAN program, this really provides us with a set of principles and a framework for the monitoring and evaluation of female representation in higher education, and particularly to address areas of underrepresentation in STEM disciplines, but clearly, many of the initiatives that are described will be more broad across the institution. So I'm going to focus on some UNSW initiatives and just some of the data that we have. And I'd love Lisa's modelling on many of these numbers, because I think that would really help us understand, how much changing the levers can actually make a difference to the representation. So. UNSW was awarded a Bronze Athena SWAN Award in 2018, having been part of the pilot program in Australia in 2015. And over the next kind of 4 years, we're working on a range of faculty and university-wide projects under the action plan. If I can have the next slide, please, Michaela. Thank you. So just a bit of information about what the Bronze Award application does. Essentially, this relies on collecting an amount of data across the institution, and Lisa talked about the data that's reported under the Commonwealth Act, and UNSW feeds into that, and we're able to look at the data across the whole institution, and that's not just the WGEA data. It may be HR, but it may be also informed by focus groups or survey type data. And the same data set is used for benchmarking across all institutions. So we're able to sort of compare against other institutions. And this looks at things like staffing for both academic and professional, full-time, part-time, and across those the levels of the levels across those disciplines. And it involves that mix of both qualitative and quantitative data. And the idea is that that data then informs the institution's individualised action plan based on where the gaps are and the appropriate actions that are targeted. Next slide, please, Michaela. So essentially, the key action areas for UNSW fall into these 7 areas, and as Lisa beautifully described, these really fall into pipeline, career development, career breaks and flexible workplace culture for UNSW, with other sort of supporting areas in terms of other areas of diversity, so transgender, intersectionality and Indigenous Australians. So for today, I'd like to just focus on some of the pipeline activities, the data that inform that, and some of the activities that sort of sit under that key action area. So you can imagine that underneath each of those key action areas, there is a number of different initiatives which sort of feed into that. Next one, please. So this was the background data, and Lisa has shown you something that's very similar to this, but this is UNSW specific data, and it's broken down by STEM versus non-STEM. So you've got that sort of falling off a cliff at level D and E for the STEM representation. Slightly different pattern amongst the non-STEM, going from a kind of a 2/3, 1/3 split at level A to a reverse split at level E. So again, a falling off a cliff, but a slightly different distribution there. And from Lisa's data, she was showing there that you have about 50% representation of women at those lower academic levels in STEM, falling to about 20%. So UNSW, at least in the 2016 data that informed our action plan, was slightly below that perhaps average representation there. I'm changing the slides here, but you've got to do that, Michaela. Sorry. So I guess in terms of thinking about how a plan is put together, there's some obviously reflection on what initiatives have been shown in the literature to work, which initiatives have been shown to, from an evidence-based perspective, to improve female representation. And I loved Lisa's presentation here because it kind of captures all of these. So most of the initiatives that have been described in the literature kind of fall within those 5 areas. So talking about organisational processes and procedures, and that might be around recruitment or promotion. It talks about the commitment of leadership within an organisation. So what's the culture around awareness, implementation of those procedures? Mentoring and networking is a very powerful group of initiatives which works in terms of improving gender representation, things like job sharing, community of practice initiatives, female leadership development programs, and providing the support tools to allow female retention at those higher levels and encouraging promotion. And I know Lisa Williams is going to be talking about some of these specific initiatives in science. One thing I really wanted to just flag here was that a really important thing is about measuring outcomes. And I think that's where I've been so excited by the Athena SWAN program, in that you don't change anything unless you measure it, and from Lisa's perspective, you don't change it unless you model it. But this has been one of the things which has now found its way into outcome reportings for all levels across the university, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. If I can have the next slide, please, Michaela. So going back to those pipeline activities that were under the Athena SWAN Bronze Award for UNSW, you can see what I've done here is I've got a bit of a laundry list of some of those initiatives that have been put in place, and I've tried to sort of group them against those targeted areas that we know have some impact based on the evidence. So improving retention policies and procedures, and again, I know Lisa will talk a little bit about this from the science perspective. In 2019, we had some quite a difference in terms of promotion policies and procedures. There was a balance across the promotion pillars. Rope guidelines were introduced in 2020. So those things that are being implemented and used across the organisation not only talk to the policies and procedures, but also the sort of culture of the organisation. Networks both internally and externally, and I'm sorry to use the alphabet soup here, but the early career networks, women in research, academic women in leadership, and the Women's Wellbeing Academy. These all have good evidence over time of showing an improvement in female representation in leadership and supporting from a community of practice perspective. faculty-based targeted recruitment schemes have been effective in engineering and in science and in other disciplines here, and I know Lisa will talk a little bit about that. I spoke about the data reporting, and one of the things that happened as a result of the Bronze Action Plan was to embed gender targets in the council KPIs at UNSW of a 40% representation of women in leadership levels in academic positions at D&E and in professional positions at level 10+. So not only are they reported quarterly now, they've also cascaded down to the faculty. So again, that brings all these things to front of mind. And I wanted just to mention some emergent activities and particularly, and Lisa mentioned this about COVID activities, and we're part of a group that has been looking at COVID related impacts across universities in Australia and Canada, and Ioannia Rania has been leading that area at UNSW, and that's really looked very specifically at attitudes around job security and productivity with working from home, and we're looking to further assess that over time. Another initiative which has recently emerged is around career coaching. If I can have the next slide, please, Michaela. Thank you. And again, this is a new initiative, and I'm sort of speaking slightly out of turn here. This is Lizzie Muller's the lead on this project, but this is recognising women with caring responsibilities, not just around children, but also looking after aged parents or individuals with disability, and the difficulty faced with moving into leadership roles. So this is an initiative that's of the Women's Wellbeing Academy, supported by Athena SWAN, and it's to support women to undertake leadership roles when they have these other responsibilities. So it's not only workshops and support for leadership activities, but it's also trying to look at what types of structural changes might help to support that movement, whether that's things like job share in associate dean and other leadership positions, but what are some other practical assistance that can be provided. And there is another piece to this, which is advocating for evidence-based change. So this is a primarily philanthropic funded initiative, and I would say that, you know, there's a lot of pilot initiatives that ultimately should be absorbed into business as usual for the university to make sure that they're sustainable over time. If I can have the next slide, please. Just to talk about the next couple of years, will be a process of looking at how effective those initiatives have been. It's very difficult to dissect out which ones are the most effective, but we will be looking at that and then applying for Signet Awards in some of these areas which demonstrate impact and outcome, and then apply for a Silver Award with a new 5-year action plan is our ultimate aim. Next slide, please. So just a quick where we're at UNSW. This is the same graph I showed at the start, just showing the shift in STEM and non-STEM. The darker colours there just show the 2021 data, and you can just see there that at the D&E levels there's been a shift of about 20% in those levels across STEM, and becoming to a sort of 55-45 split in the non-STEM at professor level. If I can have the next slide, please, Michaela. This is just showing the reporting over time across the university for academic levels D&E in STEM and the professional level 10. So I'm just showing the different divisions and faculties here, and you can see on the left side there the medicine really staying very static at that very high level of 40% representation of women. Science is the yellow line there, rising from about 16% to 28%. So that's a massive improvement over that base. And both engineering and Canberra, which are STEM heavy, showing there a slightly more modest but quite significant improvement over their baseline levels. With professional staff, it's a little bit more choppy. The numbers are low, so there is a little bit of variation there, but you can see a rather more positive final outcome there for particularly Canberra and medicine. I'm showing at the bottom there just the all UNSW D&E women's representation was 28% in 2017 and 35% in 2021, 48% professional and 54% in 2021. If I can have the next slide, please. And then this is just, again, picking up one of Lisa's points about representation. This is just showing the proportions of staff going for promotion. So out of the cohort that goes for promotion, what's the male-female split? And again, this is showing over time that it hovers around 50-50 for the non-STEM groups, but in the STEM, it's more like 60-40, so a better representation than we see amongst the academic staff. So within the cohorts that are going for promotion, women are represented at a higher rate. I'm showing you here the participation rate, which is based on the number of staff at the cohort of the level. So if you're going for level D, it's a proportion of those going for level D versus the number that are at level C in the cohort. So you can see there, these are the participation rounds, and you can see that 2019 there was a higher participation round as there was a change in those promotion requirements and widening I guess the requirements around what you could use to make your case. And the success rates there are high across STEM and non-STEM. So I think what this is showing is that there's a good participation rate in promotion in female staff and high success rates, which are similar in STEM and non-STEM. Just moving on to the next slide there. So just finally, there have been various evaluations in 2017 and 2020 of the Athena SWAN program in Australia, showing that it has proven to be a successful framework for improving representation. Clearly more to be done, but there is a sort of ongoing evaluation process here. So I'll stop there and hand over to Lisa.
Hi, my name is Lisa Williams. Thank you for a wonderful setup to a presentation today. By way of introduction, I'm currently Co-Associate Dean, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion in the Faculty of Science. I'm also Associate Professor in the UNSW School of Psychology. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about some of the initiatives that we've been doing within the Faculty of Science, and I'll be a little brief on some of these points as the lead-in from Lisa and Fiona have really set the context. But to mention quickly, in the broader sense of what we've been developing within the faculty, it's important to be aware of the explicit targets for levels D and E academic. There is a corresponding target for professional staff, but the initiatives I'm going to be speaking about today are really geared towards academic staff in most part. We also have this university-wide SAGE Athena SWAN Bronze Award and the associated 5-year plan. As Fiona introduced, there are lots of activities going on in that remit. But specifically within the Faculty of Science, I'd like to note that the context under which we've been taking these initiatives has happened under a really supportive faculty leadership. So our Dean, Emma Johnston, made it very clear when taking up her position as Dean that equity, diversity, and inclusion broadly and gender equity should be front of line in our activities. And in some ways, as part of a consequence of that, we have dedicated professional staffs to support our activities. So project officers to help run these initiatives, and also named EDI roles. So for instance, this Associate Dean role. And I think these really set the context for being able to move the levers within the faculty specifically. So we're going today to be covering 3 of the 4 main initiatives that exist within the faculty. These are our current recruitment policy, our Level Up Promotion Support Program, the Momentum Scheme for carers, and the Women in Maths and Science Champions Program, which I'm going to acknowledge exists, but I'm not going to talk about it in any detail today. So in terms of our recruitment policy, this was first developed in 2017. We consulted and drew from best practice in higher education and other sectors in how to develop a policy that would suit both professional and academic staff recruitment and also help meet these gender targets. So the highlights within the guidelines as they currently read are that we must have 1/3 competitive women applicants on the shortlist and at the interview stage, 1/3 women of the selection panel, and the requirement that job adverts include information about EDI at the university and faculty, as well as having those job adverts explicitly placed in forums that might result in applications from more diverse pools. So for instance, if you're hiring within physics, to make sure that your job advert is going into, for instance, women in physics groups to make sure that they're being seen. The current guidelines also stipulate that the selection panel members must have undergone unconscious bias training. So as I mentioned, this policy went into place in 2017. It's a little overdue in its review, but we're currently undertaking a review in that, looking at our adherence to these formal guidelines. So on that front, what I'm able to say right now is that the criteria for selection panel membership is uniformly met. This is enforced by HR during the selection process. The self-reported data on gender of candidates is a little bit stickier because, of course, this is voluntarily provided. It turns out we have data on about 50%. So 50% of our applicants choose to self-identify their gender. So it's a little bit hard to come to conclusions about whether we're officially meeting our guidelines there. So in addition to that data review of where we currently stand on the guidelines, we're also considering whether those stipulations are really appropriate for what we now understand. And one of the things we're revisiting is the training requirement regarding unconscious bias training, whether that has a role in this setting, and if so, what form that should take. The other thing to note is that since the original introduction of these guidelines, there have been university level guidelines put in place. So for instance, the university level policy has a slightly different rule on selection panel criteria. So now we'll chat about Level Up, which is our promotion support program. This was designed to help our staff within the faculty prepare applications for academic promotion. We modeled our program based on successful programs at other universities, for instance, University of Sydney, and we catered the content specifically to the UNSW science context. There is a university level promotion workshop scheme. However, we wanted to really provide information catered to our staff. Another aspect of this program worth noting is that it involves a cohort model. So applicants, participants in the program are encouraged to form small groups and consult with each other, share draft applications. So we're trying to build in a small social network within this support program. Next point, please. So we developed the program in 2018. The first cohort went through in the 2018-2019 rounds of promotion, and we've run it yearly since. Now, what we've decided to do over the years is kind of target where this program is sitting based on what we're seeing in some of those staff cuts that Fiona was showing a moment ago. So in 2018-2019, we opened the program to all genders for staff going from level C to level D, or potentially to level D. In 2019-2020, we included levels B to C, and in this latest round, we focus specifically on B to C. Next slide, please. So I'm going to present two ways to look at the outcomes. These are not the only ways, and each of these has potentially some hiccups, but I will present the success rates and promotions by gender that we're seeing. So here are the success rates of female applicants. I will say some of these numbers are relatively low, so even an unsuccessful bid from one person can push around these overall percentages quite a lot. What you see here in gray are success rates of female applicants in years that the Level Up program was not running. And in maroon here, I've plotted the data of success rates of program participants who ended up participating. I think there is some evidence that success rates are continuing to be high. This isn't necessarily the area where we would see Level Up to have the most traction because the rates are overall very high. Next slide, please. So here we have the number of people promoted. So one of the goals of the program is to help encourage women to apply for a promotion, of course, hoping that they're successful when they do decide. So here we have male applicants, or sorry, male promoted staff in hashed and dark maroon for women. Next, please. And in what I've highlighted here are the years in which the Level Up program is run. So particularly at the levels B and C levels, what you can see here is a much higher count of women being successfully promoted in the years that Level Up is run. Now, of course, we can't identify exactly that Level Up had a driving force in that, but I think the evidence here over a few years is showing increased encouragement of women to apply and ultimately be successful. Now I'm going to touch briefly on our Momentum scheme. So this is a financial support scheme to support carers during their leave or upon return from extended leave. This has had several iterations over the years. Prior to 2019, there was one award to meet this particular cohort. It was particularly for women parents, and it was awarded at $25,000. In 2019, we shifted the scheme to try and meet the need for more broad support within the faculty. We awarded 2 awards at a smaller amount. There was a budget freeze in 2021, so no awards were given. And this year, we really took the opportunity to revamp this scheme to consider how we might best place our financial support to meet both the backlog from 2020, but also maybe a broader remit. So we made 2 important decisions that I'd like to highlight here as an example of something you can do in these types of initiatives to be a bit creative. First, we opened this scheme to both academic and professional and technical staff. This is the first program I'm aware of in the university to do that for carers. And we also extended it to caring of any type and gender inclusive. So this scheme is open to both women and men staff to apply. So in brief, looking at where we are to date, we've awarded $54,000 to support 13 staff members. These include 3 professional and technical staff. So prior to this year, they would not have been supported, and also 2 male staff. So I'm excited to see the trends in that award scheme continue, hopefully, into the future. And to finish off, I'd like to just note a few kind of learning lessons here broadly about where we've been with these initiatives. Oh, sorry. First, what I'm going to do is show you kind of the where we were and where we are now. Fiona presented some of this data across STEM, but this is specifically Faculty of Science data. This is one way to look at whether some of these initiatives are having the impacts we want. So here's the classic scissor plot in July 2017. So aside from level A, things are pretty dire and falling off quite precipitously by level E. Where we are now is quite a nicer picture. So this scissor is closing. And you can see here at the bottom the overall percentages at this combined D and E target, which the university discusses. We're at 28%. So now to the key learning notes. The first I'd like to say is to consult widely. It's easy to develop these types of initiatives and policies without kind of being aware of the broader context, both within an organization as well as the broader, maybe higher education or research sector. It turns out you need not reinvent the wheel. So there's great precedent around to draw from to meet the particular needs. The other thing that's been really clear in the last few years of trying to develop and evaluate these initiatives is the need to have access to data regularly in a compilable format. And I think this has to do with the kind of formal staff cuts types of data I was just showing you, but also more evaluative data. So we do undertake participant feedback surveys from the Level Up participants as one example. And the third is to review and revise your initiatives regularly. So there are other initiatives I haven't talked about today that we've launched and then stopped because it was clear that they weren't necessarily meeting our goals at the moment. So I think with that, I'll wrap up on our Faculty of Science initiatives and open broadly to Q&A for our remaining time.
That's fantastic. Thank you for those 3 brilliant talks, really summarising the picture of women in leadership in STEM and across Australia, bringing in that data from the UK and also kind of within our Faculty of Science at UNSW. It was really brilliant to see those all in one space. Now is our time for Q&A session. For those of you in the audience, please feel free to enter any questions you have into the Q&A chat box, and we will ask those of our panel. To start our Q&A, I have a question for Lisa Cooley. It's slightly selfishly based. I mean, so you showed some lovely, interesting data for how to improve things within astronomy. I'm interested to know if you have kind of some insight from your consulting, how other fields with a lower fraction of women in the pipeline, so astronomy has a reasonable attraction of higher degree students who are women, you know, how do physics and engineering who have a lower fraction of women, unfortunately, in their pipelines, how do they then increase those fractions?
Just unmuting. Can you? Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so we actually, in astronomy, is actually not as great as you'd think in the pipeline. The students are at around 30%, so PhD students at around 30%. We've actually got a higher proportion of postdocs in astronomy, between 40 to 50%. That's because we're hiring from overseas. And if we were just hiring from within our own Australian pool, we'd be at 30%. You know, at a maximum across the board. I have modelled departments, and in fact my own astronomy department is far less than this, but also engineering departments and some physics departments as well have lower proportions of women in the pipeline, so the postdoc levels is lower. In almost all cases you require 50-50 hiring, but that's often not the only problem. So usually in the areas where you've got quite a low proportion of women at all levels, there's actually significant departures of women compared to men relative to their cohorts. So that means that the numbers of women leaving from the postdoc level, and also sometimes from level C in particular, I see it a lot. You've got maybe 1.5 to twice as many women leaving as men relative to their numbers that are already in those levels at the university. You want that to be equal if retention is happening at an equal rate. And so it's often that retention measures are required in addition to some 50-50 hiring. And then I've also seen some cases where women aren't being promoted at equal rates relative to their cohorts. Women are often waiting to apply for promotion or it's just not being paid attention to. We actually, the UK in particular, if you look at the UK, this is a real problem for women to get to the higher levels. There's a real barrier. And so it actually, the modelling produces different predictions for what's going to close the gender gap for different departments and different colleges and different disciplines. And that really depends on the history of the discipline.
Thank you, Lisa. That's really interesting. We've had questions from the audience. If people are particularly interested in any question, please feel free to click the thumbs up, and I will try and use that weighting to make sure we answer those more popular questions first. So I'll start with the first one. These are fantastic initiatives, but we need to make sure that no one is left behind. What is being done to first collect data on multicultural diversity and then address issues for that cohort? I'm going to go to Lisa Williams first.
Thanks, Sarah. So this is a really great question, and I think something to note, and I'm glad it came up because intersectionality in this space is a known factor to impact. So pretending as if any gender equity initiatives are going to land equally from people from other diverse backgrounds is a bit naive. The data at UNSW on multicultural diversity is a self-identified culturally and linguistically diverse background. This is voluntary for staff, and so we're kind of constrained by the response rates in this space. I will leave it to Fiona perhaps to comment on what we're seeing at the kind of university level or Sage Athena SWAN side of things. Within the faculty regarding multicultural diversity, we're exploring options for cultural competence training to ensure that our promotion support schemes, for instance, are going to land well for those who are evaluating them. So I'll leave it there and pass it over to Fiona.
Thanks very much, Lisa. So I kind of echo the difficulty with data collection and the sort of self-identification, and I think that the data collection probably comes a little bit more from the survey type information rather than from information that HR collect, and so sort of surveys, focus groups, more qualitative type evidence. And I think that what you say is absolutely right in that, you know, the initiatives don't necessarily bring everybody along with them, and intersectionality is something which has been recognised by SAGE, and with all of the reporting and all of the next steps and the evaluation and the Signet Awards and so on, they have asked that the initiatives are presented with an intersectionality lens and with other sort of diversity type lenses, so that they can be evaluated and, you know, rather than sort of disaggregated data. And the problem, I think, that, as Lisa alluded to, is that because all of the data around HR is self-reported, you know, it's very hard to collect the data. It's very hard to report on the data without identifying individuals. And that's made things a little bit more complex. But I think things are moving in the right direction in terms of reporting on initiatives and evaluating them over time.
And I'd love to hear from Lisa Cooley as well. Lisa, you're muted. Got it.
Sorry, it's taken me a while to unmute. Can you just repeat the question?
Just to say, sorry.
I mean, it was about other forms of diversity.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from a modelling perspective, we don't have access to any statistics on the other forms of diversity through the Athena SWAN or the SAGE program data, because that was really provided in terms of gender. One of the recommendations from the models is that universities be required to in future provide in particular numbers of people from you know, different ethnic or cultural backgrounds, or members of Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander communities, and that this is something that could be self-reported. You know, people don't have to report that, but it could be a choice, and that would allow us to actually model those groups. And there's nothing in the models that says it has to be, you know, gender. It's basically just one population, and another population can be modeled. It can be anything really. It could be people with disabilities also.
Okay, I note that we are running short on our scheduled meeting time, so I'd just like to ask there's one more question that got lots of thumbs up, so we'll ask Lisa Williams. Can I ask, what activities are the Momentum scheme funds to be used for? In particular, can it be used for teaching buyout? Context considering reduced teaching workload for staff returning from leave.
That's an excellent question. So we have a scheme for academic staff on continuing or convertible contracts, and then those on fixed term contracts and professional and technical staff. So to keep it brief, for our continuing and convertible contract academic staff, they can apply to use the funds for any number of activities to support teaching or research. We haven't had to date any applicants for official teaching buyout, but we do list, for instance, an example to pay for a head tutor to help out with coordinating roles. So it would depend on the applicant how they want to divvy up their awarded funds, and approval from a head of school about arranging buyout if there's staff there to support the activity.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to acknowledge the time and say, we've now reached the end of today's event, and I'd like to thank all of the audience for joining us today. I'd also like to extend a sincere thank you to Professor Lisa Cooley, Fiona Stapleton, and Lisa Williams for their wonderful presentations and sharing their expertise and their experiences with us today. I'd also really like to thank Michaela Vire and Kira West for their work behind the scenes in pulling this event together and also running the live event today. This presentation has been recorded and will be made public and shared with everyone who's registered for the event today. If you've got a spare few minutes now, there'll be a link to a feedback survey shared via the Q&A chat function. And we would appreciate any feedback you have on today's virtual event. We'd also like to invite you to join our student-led Inclusive Science Series event next week on September 28th, which will focus on the neurodiversity movement in science. And the link to register for this event will also be included in the chat. And with that, I'll say thank you very much, everybody.